You're ready.
Alright, so how many of us remember in elementary school when we all had to take a STEM or 9 test or some kind of testing where you had to fill in A, B, C, D, or E? And I know all of you, if you're from California, you guys had to have taken a test because it is required by law. So before I get into my proposition, I want to set up the landscape. And I want to talk about how in the 1980s, the National Commission on Excellence in Education was put together to basically survey the American education system and see how it was doing. And because of that, there was a follow-up report named A Nation at Risk. So A Nation at Risk basically determined that 13% of all 17-year-olds were functionally illiterate. What's more interesting is that 40% of them couldn't draw inferences from written material, that is. So from that stuff, it was recommended that a lasting reform would be issued and to create the best effort and performance from all students. And that was basically the beginning of standardized testing. So it was the passing of the Improving America School Act and the Educate America Act that standardized testing started to become used. But it didn't skyrocket until the passing of No Child Left Behind. And with the passing of No Child Left Behind, a new era of local control, parental involvement, and funding became conversations of the nation's education system. But most importantly, it was accountability. And by accountability, I mean that these tests would measure exactly how schools were performing and would get grades based on that performance. So No Child Left Behind basically gave sanctions to schools. If you did good, you got rewarded, and if you did bad, you suffered the consequences. So according to Pearson, U.S. students have slipped from 18th in the world in math to 31st place in 2009 since tests were first initiated, with almost a similar decline in science and virtually no change in reading and comprehension. So proponents say that tests are a fair and objective measure of student ability, yet there's no increase in achievement. Therefore, my claim is that standardized testing negatively affects students. It narrows the curriculum, carries high stakes, harms minority communities, and is costly. Before I begin, I want to give some definitions, and that is that standardized testings are tests administered under controlled conditions and carefully monitored to prevent from cheating. And for the purposes of this claim, it's those administered in the K-12 system. High stakes are standardized test results that are determined as high stakes if they carry serious consequences for students or educators. Minority can be, for the purpose of this claim, are those who are Black, Hispanic, or economically disadvantaged. And the AYP, Adequate Yearly Progress, measures the academic performance of schools and is defined by the Department of Education. So my first supporting claim is that standardized testing is associated with high stakes. Basically, it determines whether students move on to the next grade or they graduate. And when this first happened, No Child Left Behind, there was a huge catastrophe happened in Boston, where about 20,000 to 70,000 students failed their first standardized testing, which meant that they were not going to be allowed to go on to the next level. That's basically more than 25% of the students. Carrying this implication is that low scores also determine high dropout rates. Although retention is commonly used, it's been said that retention also equates to higher dropout rates. According to a study published in Education, Evaluation and Policy Analysis titled Getting Tough, the impact of high school graduation exams states that retain from high school dropout rates. Although using tests as a graduation requirement may seem like one way to increase student accountability, some research found that it can increase the number of students who drop out. Secondly, standardized tests narrow the curriculum. That means that they only focus on math, literature, and reading. What about art? What about science? And the implications of high standard testing is that teachers have to focus their curriculum to be basically a test method. So now they're teaching to the test instead of teaching to the curriculum. Standardized testing also harms the minority community. These standards students, according to the study done by a Harvard professor, these students typically score lower than their white counterparts. And it's because of the stereotype threat, which basically says if someone tells you that you're not going to do well, any minority, you're expected to not do well. And finally, standardized testing is costly. It's a $1.7 billion enterprise. If you were to divide that by, a salary $50,000 for a teacher, you could potentially hire 344,000 new faculty members. It can be appropriated elsewhere. It can be appropriated for better skill building and whatnot. And there's also a quote that I want to say is that by the superintendent of public instruction, Ritz, it said that I'm not going to spend $460 million on testing. Instead, she simply puts that they're going to be used for instructional purposes. So basically, the purpose of the test is to make a one-size-fits-all. But from trying on one-size-fits-all garments, we know that sometimes one-size-fits-all doesn't really work. So basically what I'm trying to say is that standardized testing doesn't work, even though it's a one-size-fits-all. It negatively affects students, it narrows the curriculum, it affects minority communities, it's costly, and finally, it is associated with high stakes. Thank you.
Okay, Julio, I thought that the introduction is pretty good at setting up the controversy, but it takes you a long time to get through, and then you spend a big chunk of time defining terms that don't really seem like they're ever going to be important in the argument. So there's not really much point in spending time on those things, and it takes up a lot of time. It felt like you don't really get to the body of your speech until halfway through the speech, and at that point you're kind of having to rush through some of those supporting points. I thought you had a really good, clear layout of what the supporting structure was at the beginning of the speech, and you did okay signposting on that first point, but after that the material started to run together. There isn't really some individual signposting as you go along. Now, when you got back to the summary at the end of the speech, I could hear the points that you talked about, but now it sounds like instead of the 3 points that you were talking about at the beginning, like you've got 5 or 6 points that you're finishing up with at the end. So there's a little bit of inconsistency. And listeners to arguments, they need that kind of consistency. So you got to give them a little bit more structure. On the evidence, I think that you did a pretty good job, like I said, explaining the ideas, but talking about the consequences, I think you need stronger evidence. Because at one point, for instance, you say it narrows the curriculum. Okay, so why is that a bad thing? Your argument basically is that this is having a negative effect. Well, what's the negative effect of a narrower curriculum? Especially if the narrower curriculum, they start doing better on, like the math scores or those kinds of things. You also have the argument that says they haven't really improved the scores. Is it but I don't think you were trying to make the argument that it's causal in nature, and I don't think you have any evidence to show that it's causal in nature. You just basically kind of stop at that point and aren't really talking about what's going on. You're just saying, these things create a problem. But the problems, you need to explain a little bit more what the problems are. Maybe there's a cost burden involved. By the way, I'm not a math whiz at those kinds of things, but it sounds to me like $1.5 billion is not going to pay for 300,000 teachers. I think there's a 0 or 2 or a decimal point misplaced there. I'd have to double check on those numbers. I think you want to be careful about that sort of thing. I thought you did a nice job talking to the audience and directing things to us, and like I said, explaining things. But I think your structure needs to be a little bit clearer, and you need some stronger evidence that talks about what the negative impacts of some of those points are. All right, thank you for getting us started.